Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for grabbing a drink and coming to see us down this end of the conference area. Again, for those that weren't at the session earlier, I'm Sarah Edwards. I'm the president of Eunomia Research and Consulting in North America. And I'm really pleased for this last session of Monday's agenda to be here with Rachel from the beer store. I'll let Rachel introduce herself, and then she's got a few slides to give us a bit of an introduction about the work that the beer store's doing on refillable programs as well. So, yeah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Rachel Moray. I'm the Director of Sustainability at the Beer Store. And for some of you that are not familiar with the Beer Store, we are based in Ontario. Sorry. Okay, so for some of you that are not familiar with the Beer Store, what makes us popular, globally actually, is that we have one of the oldest reuse programs in the world. And not only are we the oldest program, we're also a scalable reuse solution. So we actually offer a refillable bottle across the country. And as you know, Canada is a very large country. So what you see on your screen is actually the industry standard bottle. It's a 341 milliliter long neck brown bottle. And what makes it special is you have basically one bottle that is shared across competing brewers. So for folks that may not drink beer, it's essentially like having Coke and Pepsi share a container format, which is pretty phenomenal. So in this particular example, in Canada, the beer store actually acts as a cooperative. So our large shareholders being Molson Coors, Labatt, which parent company is Anheuser-Busch, and Sleeman, which is owned by Sapporo. So it's actually owned by 30 brewers, and we also distribute beer across Canada. So how do we get to this model? It really started almost a century ago, before circular economy and climate change were even a topic. And it really was because it made business sense, right? This is following the prohibition. And the brewers thought, well, why would we have empty trips when we were delivering full goods? Why not have empties come back? And we're also saving on the actual commodity material. So those principles still hold true today. And so, of course, we've evolved quite a bit since that time. So next slide, please. And we have over 400 stores in the province of Ontario alone. We service over 16,000 licensees, including bars and restaurants in the province. And we have over 6,000 employees. So this model obviously has expanded. We have over 1,000 brands. Not all of them, of course, in the refillable bottle, but it's an essential part of our program. And so what makes this model unique is not only are we distributing the beer, we are obviously the retailer as well, but we also act essentially as a depot. So that kind of fully integrated services makes it a lot easier to kind of dictate on how we manage the system. So part of my work and the work of my team here is to make sure that system continues to run as efficiently as possible from a business perspective, to continue to make sure that reuse model still makes business sense for brewers, so that no matter the type of brewer, no type of producer, large or small, they are welcome to join this important shared reuse model. So next slide, please. So the reusable format has actually expanded besides the industry standard bottle. Some larger brewers that have large brands, one example would be Miller Genuine Draft, also chooses to have a refillable format, and that is known as a private mold bottle. And of course, you have refillable kegs, which have been around for a long time too, since the 1960s. So I just wanted to give you a sense of scale. So the distribution is very large across the country, and we also have a separate distribution arm, also known as Brewers Distributors Limited, which manages the distribution across the other western provinces as well. So on the next slide, just to give you a scale, a sense of scale of what that actually looks like. So the picture on the right is just an example of one of our warehouses in BC of empty refillable bottles that are stacked. So you can see different colors of different brands being ready to be shipped to the brewer for refill. So that means it'll go through the line, different brand, it doesn't matter what it is, it could be a competing brand. When it's done going through the brewer, it's going to be depackaged, it's going to be cleaned, pasteurized, and then go through the refillable process and ensure that that's their branded beer at the end of the day. And so just to give you an example of what that looks like, of the total process, we not only just have refillables, it is integrated with single use. So in our program, we want to ensure that we communicate what is ensuring that the reusable bottles can be brought back to the system. So the average is 15 times per bottle before it is being recycled. And the single-use containers can still be separated and have high-value recycling as well. So nothing that comes through our stores gets directly sent to landfill or incineration or road aggregate. So again, that's a really important story of our circular economy journey. So maybe I'll just pause there and we'll kind of go into questions.
Yeah, cool. I think you mentioned a few really important points there, and obviously this is a policy talk stage. So first of all, like how important are the deposit return system or the bottle bills or the, recycling rewards programs to the kind of refillable programs across Canada?
Yeah, and it's a great question. So the beer store is really interesting because the brewers have done this, predates regulation. And that's really important aspect because when Ontario decided to go and expand to all alcohol containers, specifically Ontario, it was able to pull glass out of the municipal recycling and increasing glass diversion as a result. So it went from I think it was in the 40s right away into the higher 60s in the first year. I think it was 68% diversion, and now we're seeing increase, up around 80% for those containers, and even higher for the refillable bottles. You see, there was a 96% recovery rate in 2022, so just last year. So I think there is ongoing interest with new targets from government. So, we're hearing a 90% recovery rate by 2030 for beverage containers. And I think there's a realization that we can't get those high return rates without having a deposit return system. And so these talks are we're seeing across the province of either improving existing systems or modernizing, or introducing to areas that don't already have systems, or improving the current systems that we have today.
Yeah, because clearly, obviously, the benefits, there's many benefits for reuse depending on how the system's designed, but getting those containers back, getting those bottles back so that you can have that 15 times rotation is super critical. So having the deposit on the container is obviously a good mechanism for you reaching that 98%.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the important thing to keep in mind as we're thinking about the modernization is that glass is not like any other single-use container, right? It's delicate. It has to be sorted separately. And so in our communications, it's trying to provide the education piece to policymakers that it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all, to ensure that successful programs today continue to remain intact, and to allow it to evolve in a collaborative discussion. So I think that's really critical when we are kind of at a point where some folks are starting from scratch and have no idea of really how deposit system works and how to make it happen. I think what's really critical in for folks that are trying to understand reuse is it's really a conversation with all your value chain partners. And I think what makes the Canadian beer industry unique is because there's that integration of business where there's more control over the distribution network. And so I think that will be a continuous conversation going forward for other people that are trying to explore reuse models.
Yeah. And I think obviously one of the other things we always consider with reuse models is obviously the reuse network, and how really for, recycling materials can be collected, baled, shipped to wherever the market is. But really with a refillable, reusable program, you need local infrastructure. So maybe you can just talk a little bit around that kind of local infrastructure that's in place to ensure that you have, minimum distances traveled, and that you can, and the kind of little bit of the process around what happens once it gets collected a little bit through to like the washing and piece again.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think Ontario is unique in that because we have the retail stores that's also acting as a depot. We also have our processor nearby, and we also have a glass manufacturing facility nearby. And then, of course, the brewers themselves have their key brewing facilities all within Ontario and mainly in southern Ontario. So having that hub really makes it kind of easier in terms of the distribution and delivery of beer. In the other provinces, I think it's a little bit challenging. We see those volumes slightly lower, especially in BC and Ontario, but BC and Alberta, for those of you that know your Canadian geography. But they have those a couple breweries out there that those bottles will go to. But generally, I would say Ontario would have the higher increase in volume into the refillable format because of that proximity of those other facilities in mind. And of course, it has to make sense, not only, of course, from the financial aspect, but now we are exploring more about understanding the climate impacts because glass is heavy. So understanding that, more data is asked for, that we have that information ready in terms of, the pros and cons and, the different considerations that are made when we're considering different reuse models.
Okay. And the other piece you touched on, what I think is super interesting that we don't always think about is like kind of the universal bottle, the like industry, like brewers coming together or, soft drink manufacturers, if we get to move that way, coming together and aligning around a universal bottle. How important is that really to the efficiency and effectiveness of the program? Yeah,
that's critical. So we've had other industries, for example, wine, be interested and ask us questions of like, what does it take to have a reuse format? And the industry standard bottle, if any of you goes to Ontario and wants to buy beer, of course you're welcome to shop at the beer store. But you'll notice that there's scuff marks on the bottom of the ISB bottle, and that will be an indication of how many times it's been reused. And for Ontario drinkers, we don't think twice about it. It's a bit of a badge of honor. Whereas you have a different industry like wine, there's a prestigiousness around that brand, or they want to ensure that their own special, unique branding as part of it. So I think there's definitely the education piece that's making sure that your customer is comfortable with the format, or understanding different design elements to make sure that the reuse is viable and will continue to be successful. So I think some of the challenges that we see when people try to integrate reuse is as a pilot stage is how do you continue to have a sustained model over the long term and not just we'll have a short run, but again that continued economic viability coupled with the environmental viability is key in ensuring that continues to work.
Cool. And then I was thinking, obviously, this is an example of beer in glass bottles. What can other material formats, obviously there's discussion around maybe refillables in PET bottles for soft drinks, what can those, producers, manufacturers, distributors learn from maybe the beer store model or the beer model in Ontario?
Yeah, I think, there's so many different aspects. I think, even just, how we palletize bottles to make sure things fit properly. So during the collection phase, it's not just the design and how it looks, but how it moves through the process is really critical. The other thing that's really interesting, because the brewers actually have a decentralized system, so there's not one central wash hub, and so the brewers essentially have an agreement on understanding the label requirements to move forward with. So I think that's really critical. It's how can folks get together and have an agreement on what will work for everyone, because that will make it easier to tell the same story over and over again to customers so they get accustomed to it. And I think in Ontario, folks are used to, I remember I have memories of going with my grandpa and making the return. So the aspect is not only are you saving, have environmental savings from the customer perspective of buying and returning at the same place, but also from the actual full goods and empties delivery pickup as well. So having that story that we try to communicate to customers is an ongoing education piece. We can't take that behavior for granted. So the example on your screen is, we participate in the Circular Economy Month, which happens in October in Canada, also known as previously Waste Reduction Week, which has since evolved. But we continuously engage in these education pieces and investment in public awareness to ensure that behavior continues and that customer convenience piece is continually shared.
So, I mean, I know that the amount of refillable beer bottles in Canada has declined over time. Do you think the resurgence of that, the discussions around refillable and reusable now is actually, helping that maybe stabilize, but also maybe brands look a little bit more about how they can move more into refillables?
Yeah, so there's a number of factors, I think, that come into play, and I think obviously there's the convenience piece, and I would say, especially during the pandemic, there's some supply chain challenges that if we don't get the bottles back, then the brewers need to have a container. So that was a piece that contributed to it. But I think there's also obviously the policy piece is really critical because there's an incentive from the brewer's production in, if you produce in a refillable bottle program, there is a benefit for the brewers to continue to do so. So I think for policymakers, realizing those incentive mechanisms is really critical to encourage producers to do that. But then, of course, then there's the other piece of understanding, the European policy of having increased volume in reuse formats going forward. So, our job is continue to encourage brewers to investigate, and of course, making sure it's financially viable to do so. We continue to investigate other pilot projects. Like, is there ways that we can manage refillable bottles in a more efficient way that's less labor intensive? Because I think across industries, we know that the cost of labor has gone up significantly. So all these factors, even though we've been around for a really long time, we are continuously trying to evolve our solutions in order to continue to promote reuse.
Okay, last question for me, and then I'm going to go to the audience. So just, if you had a policy wish list, what would you want that to be in terms of supporting reuse both in beer and maybe other formats as well? What would you be telling the Canadian government or other states and provinces to do to encourage more reuse and refill?
Yeah, I would say definitely investment in R&D to help other industries kind of get off the ground in that initial investment piece. I would say continue to support existing systems and producers that are already taking the initiative to do so. So protect those systems and allow them to evolve and be be inclusive in discussions for other industries that are or other beverage containers that are moving to deposit. And then, of course, the incentive piece is not only protect what works well, but what are the financial incentives that you can provide to producers and encourage them to use refillable formats? So not just the investment in the R&D and the innovation, but the actual when you're listing into the market, because there's a lot of taxes in Canada. So I think having any kind of tax break, I think, would be a big incentive for producers.
Cool. Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. So I'm going to go to the audience now. If anyone would like to be first on the questions. Wow, you're so shy. Oh, yes.
Do you see the potential privatization and opening of the retail market as something that can still facilitate the reuse model in Ontario, like the corner stores and such?
Do you want to give a bit of background to that before you answer? Because it's quite nuanced question, right, for Ontario?
Yeah, I mean, I think the environmental piece is really important because when you break off the retail piece from the collections, if it makes environmental sense, we say if you're selling it, you should be responsible for taking it back. So it's a politically driven question, so I'm very cautious of it. But I think there's a lot of sensitivity in the retail space right now. So just as an FYI, obviously there's increased interest in the sale of beer in Ontario. And historically, the beer store and the LCBO, which is the Liquor Board of Ontario that also sells wine and spirits. We're the only ones that were selling beer in the province. So I think the expansion of alcohol sales, I think from the environmental perspective, as long as if you're selling, then if you're also accepting back empties, I think that will encourage the continued high recovery rate, because as soon as you segregate that, then from an environmental perspective, you're forcing the customer to make a different trip to make returns. So that doesn't make sense. Again, you're also breaking up the behavior that Ontarians have been attributed to the high success rate that we've had to today. And I think that's a really important message, that you can't really take apart the sales versus the acceptance of empties at the same time. They need to be integrated.
Okay, great. Anyone else? No? Is anyone in the audience involved in reuse projects or refillable projects, or doing any research for their municipality or their state? Or I don't know if anyone wants to add any kind of experience of trying to get reuse or refill off the ground that anyone wants to share with the audience?
Thank you so much. This is super interesting. I'm with Reuse Seattle, and we are doing a lot of work with beer sales at music events. So getting your beer in a reusable cup that you can collect on site in a closed loop system, and we're starting there. But would really love to hear your advice for the first step of working with breweries to launch something like this.
Yeah, I think the scale is important. The more you have folks doing it, the more worthwhile it is to collect it. So I think we've tried several initiatives in trying to get folks like that on board, like sporting events, for example. So I think it's really understanding how you can economically collect all those containers and have a central. Well, I think, again, as I mentioned in the beer store, we have a decentralized system for washing, but in that case, it would probably make to have a centralized wash station and have it logistically make sense from a financial piece to make it worthwhile. So I think, again, you can't undermine the business aspect. I think, yes, it's great to have proof of concept, but in order to make it last, what's your long-term business plan to continue to drive that incentive on the long term?
There's a guy at the front here.
Did the bars participate in the program?
Yes, that's a really good question, especially as we have more talks of EPR. So how does the beer industry fit into extended producer responsibility? And the answer for the beer store is simply we were carved out of regulation because the brewers are already participating in it. So when you list with a beer store, you're paying a fee to have your bottles managed. So that is essentially extended producer responsibility. You don't need the government involved. And even when it comes to curbside, we continue to educate to make sure any deposit-bearing containers are returned through us. They shouldn't be going through the curbside program. So I think that's an ongoing conversation from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but it's generally, you can have multiple types of systems work in harmony with one another.
No, I think obviously as we talk more and more about reuse and refillables programs, there's often that discussion around the validity of different pilots and programs, because how much valuable data might you get from a program that's just been designed as a pilot, and obviously what you're talking about is a whole state or provincial wide program. So it's really difficult to understand the true economics of reuse and refill compared to single use when you're constantly looking at data that's based on probably minimal funding, right? Suboptimal containers, suboptimal logistical networks. And so it's I think it's really important that we look at programs like what's happening in Canada and the beer store, just to look at what are the different components and how can we make them most effective at scale. We may have some data around how people engage with these programs from pilot programs potentially, but in terms of scaling up and designing future programs, there's a lot to be learned from what's already happening on the ground in the beer store in Ontario, as well as other places across the globe, really. So yes, it's super interesting. I think we're probably at time and people are probably wanting to get another drink, but I want to just thank you very much for giving us such a wealth of information there, and Rachel's obviously going to be around at the conference to take more questions. So thank you, Rachel. It's been great.
Sarah. And sorry, the next slide is just my contact information, and if anybody's interested to visit Ontario, just let me know. We'll love to give you a tour. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.